I wanted to be a person to kind of help give that hope, allow others to see their gifts, their strengths, that they are someone. That's really important to me, is for people to know that they're valuable and they're worthy. How do you pull a community together to meet a need? Hey, we can do this. We can talk to each other. People of all these different views, opposing views, are coming together, and they're hearing each other, and they're talking to each other, and they're working together hand in hand, and they're, dancing together when the music's going, and they're having a blast. I mean, that's, to me, is what it's about. We're known for Table of Hope, where we have our mobile food pantry. We go out and distribute food throughout Morris County, and as well, we have a soup kitchen. We serve dinners 5 nights a week. But I think it's more than just the services we provide. We try to help people wherever they are and meet them where they are. And sometimes food is the first place where we meet them. We rely on our volunteers heavily. We have a good turnout of volunteers, as always. Our volunteers are on the forefront, very connected, develop relationships with the people that come. The last 2 years, we served about 60,000 people. And what we've tried to do is support smaller pantries who maybe can't get to food banks, as well as pockets of poverty throughout Morris County. You want to help improve the quality of life for families. I just want people to know that there are people who care and see them. And I want them to know that they're worth something.
Well, good evening, friends. We are so excited to have you for our Cornerstones for Social Impact webinar series. We've been gathering each month this year to bring information to faith-based organizations that want to have a greater social impact. In fact, 40% of all human services and educational programming are provided by faith-based organizations. By some estimates, roughly $1.7 million in economic activity is contributed by each congregation in urban areas. And with the declining rates of participation in churches and affiliation or membership attendance, faith-based organizations and legacy anchor institutions are confronting a reality of declining resources available to support their work. However, many of these institutions have significant assets, but may be cash poor. And so we're going to be talking about how to address some of those challenges. We can make an impact. You do not need a large congregation to make a greater social impact. In response to this, we organized the Oikos Institute for Social Impact. We're currently operating in 8 cities now and roughly about 70 churches, helping them increase their social impact. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Dave Cresta, Richard Babcock, and Teresa Williams to talk about the case study on the Bethel AME Church in Morristown and the Table of Hope. We're excited that you can be with us. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. Tonight, Dr. Cresta will give us a brief presentation about the case study. We're more than happy to share the case study with you. It was sponsored by Duke Leadership at Duke Divinity School. And so we're thankful for their support of this work. And we hope that this webinar will address some of your concerns, questions, and help you fostering greater imagination. Let me take a minute to introduce our guest. Teresa Williams serves as the First Lady of Bethel AME Church in Morristown and the Executive Director of the Table of Hope. And tonight she's with us to share some insights for those of you that want to start perhaps a soup kitchen or community development corporation, or just increase your social impact. And then we have Rich Babcock, co-founder and chief operating officer for the Crossing Capital Group, and also one of the co-founders of the Oikos Institute for Social Impact. And he has a tremendous business background and will help give us some insight as to how we might use this case study in our work in our local congregations and communities. And lastly, but not least, Dr. Dave Cresta, author of Jesus on Main Street, is doing some great work out on the West Coast and is doing a fair amount actually in Portland, Oregon. We were so excited to have him come out to the East Coast and conduct this case study. He did a wonderful job interviewing members of the community here in Morris County, New Jersey, as well as members of the Bethel AME Church. I want to encourage you, ask questions. Let's be conversational tonight, as always, and we're excited to have you with us. With that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Dave Cresta, who will take some time and walk us through some of the highlights of the case study. And again, feel free to ask your questions in the chat. I certainly want to welcome those of you who are watching us on YouTube, as well as Facebook. We'll be monitoring those platforms as well for questions. And if you're with us here on Zoom, we'll be monitoring your questions in the chat. Dave, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sydney. I just shared my screen. Hopefully you all can see that. You want to give me a thumbs up? All right, awesome. Let me just rearrange some real estate here. There we go. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. So I was entrusted to tell the story of Bethel Morristown Church, and I want to applaud Dr. Reverend Sidney Williams for his courage. It's not easy or safe to put yourself under a microscope and invite somebody from outside to look at your organization and look under the rug, maybe sweep away a few cobwebs. But what I saw in the course of my research really inspired me, and it encouraged me, because my mission is to really help churches become more effective in how they interact with their community. So whenever I see churches like Bethel doing amazing things, it gives me encouragement and inspiration that, yes, we can in fact make a difference, as Dr. Williams indicated in his intro. The allusion to the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 in the title of my case study was very deliberate. So this miracle story has been a guide for me personally the last several years, reminding me that God is God and that I'm not, and reminding me that whatever impact I hope to achieve in this world is squarely in God's hands. And he really needs nothing more from me than a few fish and a couple scraps of bread to bring good news to our communities. So my research focused on two primary questions. Number one, how can the small, under-resourced church create such significant community impact? You saw a little taste of that in the introductory video there. And then second, what can other churches, especially small churches, learn from the experience at Bethel? So when I say Sidney placed himself and his church under a microscope, I wasn't kidding. So over the course of several months, I did 2 site visits to Morristown, spanning 8 days in total. I interviewed almost 40 people. I interviewed volunteers, local politicians, board members, local business owners, church members, both past and present. So what did I find? When interviewees for this study were asked what words came to mind describing Bethel and the Table of Hope CDC, the most popular word was community. You see here pictures from the Table of Hope's food distribution. You saw this in the video that was shared. And yes, the statistics are really impressive. You can get all the details when you read the case study. But in 2022 alone, 42,000 families received groceries and 18,000 meals were served. And I'm sure those numbers are growing in 2023. This is vital, necessary work. But what I want to emphasize is that Bethel Church and the Table of Hope have not only delivered these goods and these services, but they've established themselves as highly respected, vital community organizations. So I think most people in Morristown and the surrounding area would be very concerned if either of these organizations went away. Think about that. They'd be very concerned if Bethel Church went away. I think very few, if any, of the churches that I have ever been involved in my life could even come close to saying that. Question remains, however, how did a small church such as Bethel become indispensable to its surrounding community? And second, what can other churches do to deliver similar outsized impact? This following quote is pulled directly from the case study's executive summary, and I'm going to go ahead and read it and then unpack a few points. Leaders should develop as much integration as possible between the work of the church and the work of the community, strengthening bonds and bridges through collective action for the common good. In a church where mission and success are defined in terms of the community's mission and success, impact will not be limited by traditional church resources. Leadership must hold the congregation accountable to the church's mission, at times nurturing, teaching, or prodding, but always leading by example. It's vital to listen to and continually assess the community for hopes and dreams, hidden needs, and untapped assets. As leaders and laity spend time developing relationships within the larger community, churches will see faith, intellectual, social, and human capital growing both inside and outside of their church. So one thing that struck me as I spent time with Sydney and Teresa and the rest of the team in Morristown was that it was really hard to distinguish between the work of the church and the work of the community. I think it's one of the primary keys. In other words, it's not about the church. So this is how most organizations, including most churches, think about themselves in relationship to the rest of the world. Notice who's in the center, the church. If you look at a lot of strategy documents for organizations, they'll be in the center and they'll show all the partners that they have kind of around them. In my book, Jesus on Main Street, I talk about the necessity for a decentered church posture. So what exactly does that look like? If the church isn't at the center, then who or what is? If you look around you, it's the community, and it's the messy set of people, businesses, governments, nonprofits, financial institutions, and yes, other churches. That's where the center is at. When you decenter yourself and your church, that's when the power and the value of a community ecosystem can come into view. So, of course, I'm not saying that the local church is unimportant, not at all. So when Pastor Sydney came to Morristown in 2010, he started knocking on doors and building relationships using the calling card of pastor of Bethel Church. The long presence of the church in the community automatically gave him some legitimacy. However, his pitch to the community stakeholders wasn't about Bethel Church per se. Rather, it was to engage in a discussion about where the community was headed, listening for the hopes and the fears that people harbored. The church's role as an anchor institution in the community was solidified not by beating its own drum, but through the work of organizations such as the Sankofa Heritage Collective of Morris County. So this collective seeks to connect the historic African-American experience in Morris County with today. And that research revealed that Bethel's history overlaps significantly with the community's history. So the ways in which the Sankofa Heritage Collective uncovered Bethel's historic rootedness helped people outside of the church start viewing Bethel not only as a church, but as an anchor institution, which in the boards of one of the CDC board members demolishes the perceived separation between church and community. So when you look at this diagram, you'll see that there are a lot of organizations that need to be connected together, both formally and more often than not informally. This leads to another major finding from the case study, and that is the importance of social capital. So I'm sure most, if not all of you, are at least somewhat familiar with the concept of social capital. So because of time constraints, I'll only mention that social capital has been recognized by many, many scholars as vital to the thriving of communities and even to the thriving of democracies. Unfortunately, social capital is in short supply in our society. And this is something I believe that churches can definitely contribute to. So Richard is one of our co-panelists here and a collaborator with Sydney. When I interviewed him, he shared this quote that I want to share with you all here. He emphasized that we must divorce yourself from the limitations of ideological, political, racial, financial, or denominational hurdles to find those who will enthusiastically commit themselves to the mutually desired outcome. In other words, connect with everybody and anybody who loves your community. So both Sydney and Teresa have developed an impressive set of partnerships and relationships. What I want to do here is just call attention to one specific instance of social capital generation that I believe was exponential in its impact. So in this example, Sydney had developed a strong relationship with the County College of Morris, which is a very important community organization for those who are may not be familiar with the area. Bethel also had church members with strong ties to the Morristown School District, so the elementary, secondary schools, etc. By helping create a bridge between these two important community organizations, the Table of Hope CDC's after-school program was able to expand significantly, and the community benefited much more than if this important bridging work had not been done. So the emphasis here is that not only was Bethel and Table of Hope creating partnerships, but they were actually facilitating partnership development and connections between other organizations within their community. That's an important point. Sydney mentioned the case study. I encourage you all to get a copy of the full case study, which goes into a lot more detail, as you can see outlined here. I conclude the case study with 15 different lessons learned. Sounds like a lot, but what I'd like to leave you with is just a quick read through of these to give you some flavor of the breadth of the findings. And I'd be happy to discuss further in the Q&A, and I'm sure the panelists will have lots to say about these things as well as we get into the Q&A. So let me just go through these. Spend time listening, lamenting, and connecting the past to the present. Document and celebrate the shared history of the church and the community. Develop the church as a community institution. Bring as much integration as possible to the work of the church and the work of the community by incorporating missional theological thinking into the teaching, preaching, and discipleship. In other words, define the church's mission and success in terms of the community's mission and success. And here, I'm sure many of you are thinking of Jeremiah 29:7. Take time to teach your congregation before making drastic changes. Leadership must be prepared to counter membership culture and hold the congregation accountable to the mission in the community in which God has placed them. There's a time for teaching, nurturing, and prodding, as well as a time for decision-making. Listen to the larger community for hopes and dreams, hidden needs, untapped assets. Research your community to find the obvious as well as the hidden pockets of poverty and brokenness. Draw attention to the true state of the community and provide ways for the community to work together through collective action. This creates bridges as well as bonds to tie the community together. Don't be content with limiting ministry to what your church can do directly. Build faith, intellectual, social, and human capital both inside and outside of your church. Spend considerable time developing relationships, which we talked about in the community ecosystem slide. Build bridges within the community, not just between your church and the community. Equip and encourage others in this work as well. Don't ask people to support an organization. Focus on developing support for a cause that has demonstrable human and community impact. Create a low barrier environment in which volunteers love to serve. So you can translate a caring, family-like ethos from your church into your community work. Emphasize relationships rather than transactions. Equip pastors with training in business, finance, community development, and related fields. Carefully consider perhaps a new role of a community pastor and how it can bring focus to community outcomes rather than more traditional church metrics. Look for integration between the spiritual nurturing inside the church with spiritual nourishing outside of the church. Second to the last, plan for the community and the church without you. Nurture new leaders. And finally, continue to look for barriers to community flourishing. Be willing to reinvent yourself and the organizations in which you serve. So thanks for allowing me to share this. I'll turn it back over to Sydney and the rest of the gang.
That was really powerful, David. I know you published a book, Jesus on Main Street. Any correlations between your book, Jesus on Main Street, and the case study? If so, what would you say some of the common overlaps are? And then what are some things that you saw that may be different?
Yeah, I mentioned one of them already. That is this decentered church posture. So really taking the church seriously, but even more seriously, the community, and giving away power, enlisting others to embark on the mission together. I'd say, in Jesus on Main Street, I focused on community economic development, so less so on relief and service type work. And as I've identified in the case study and in discussions with you, that's something to consider for future work. And so that's what I was alluding to at the end, where continue to assess your community, ask your community, figure out what they need. It could be things like workforce development. It could be things like job creation, not to give up any of the service and relief work, but to add to it. So I'd say those are a couple of things that come to mind. Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. I want to move to First Lady Teresa, our Executive Director of the Table of Hope. When you arrived to Bethel, trying to find your place there, what were some of the initial impressions you had in 2010 and some of the aspirations you had for the church and for the community?
Yeah, so, we arrived here from South Africa in 2010, and in South Africa, we did quite a bit of ministry there. And it was a very different climate, a lot of poverty, different kind of poverty, I would say, than you see here. And so when we came to Morristown, I wanted to see how could we be of service here? What are some of the gaps in human services? What is needed? So we talked to various stakeholders in the community, and that's when we found out, number one, that Black and brown children were slipping through the cracks. So we started our tutoring program to assist with that. And without getting into all the details about how Table Hope came about, when we did Table of Hope, we researched the community in terms of what is being offered for soup kitchens and food pantries, and realized that no one was serving dinner. The only individual group that was serving dinner was for men, not for families and children. So that's why we started dinner. So we made sure that we weren't really necessarily trying to compete with the services that were already being provided. We wanted to try to fill in gaps, and then also develop partnerships with other service providers, other organizations, so that we can all work together to really build up the people in our community that need the help the most.
How would you say Table Hope has expanded since its inception?
The pandemic had a lot to do with astronomical growth in Table of Hope. Prior to the pandemic, our food pantry was serving about 70 people a week. And after the pandemic hit, it was 2,000 people a week. So we were really stretched for resources and capacity, but because of the community and the relationships that have been developed, we were able to utilize those relationships to help us to get Table of Hope, to be able to travel to different towns in Morris County, to be able to get the food that we needed to get and to distribute the food we needed to get. We were able to get support in that. And also, a lot of the food pantries and soup kitchens, they pulled back and were closed. And there were a couple of things that happened. Not only were we really the only ones distributing food during the height of the pandemic, we were the only ones giving people an opportunity to give back. And while the pandemic was very tragic for many people, and unfortunate, in our case, a lot of people wanted to come and help. We had a tremendous amount of volunteers that were birthed in the pandemic that still work with us to this day, because at that time we gave them an opportunity to have meaning and to do something to serve their community. And just one quick example, there was a young woman who was working at our soup kitchen, and she had lost her daughter, who was a healthcare worker during the pandemic, very young. Her daughter was in her 20s. And so she was taking care of her 7-year-old granddaughter, and she came and served with us every week. And she just said, this gives me meaning. This helps me to get through this difficult time. So while, yes, we served a lot of people, a lot of families, and still do, but the community aspect, the connectedness, not only just with the volunteers, but the volunteers with the people we serve, there's just relationships that are being established that are becoming long-term and very meaningful to many.
Thank you. That's really insightful. And I know there are a lot of people who will watch this video or webinar rather, and many churches have pantries. How would you distinguish a Table of Hope from, say, a typical church pantry? What's different? What should people try to do that's different to emulate what Table of Hope has accomplished?
Well, I think the first thing is that we don't just utilize, we don't limit it to just church members. We open it to the community. So we have a significant amount of people just from the community, from different churches, businesses, retired people that are not members of the church who support the pantry. So I think that's very unique, because I think many church pantries limit themselves by what the church members can do. And I think that's what makes us very different. Even with our tutoring program, what we've experienced is that a lot of churches, many of the churches we collaborate with, they rely on what the church members can do for the tutoring. So if you don't have church members, then you're not going to have tutors. Whereas we always have collaborated with outside resources, universities, the high school. I just think that's the difference. We don't limit it to just what church members can do.
Mm-hmm. Any other advice you'd give to faith leaders who want to use this case study and maybe pick up on some of the things that Dave shared, or any other insight you may want to offer faith leaders?
Yeah, I don't think you should just start doing a soup kitchen or a tutor program just because you think it's a great idea. I think you really need to look at your community and what is needed. And when you look at the community and look at the needs and talk to the various stakeholders in the community, don't limit what you can do by what you currently have as your resources. Because once you have a vision for what you want to do and you share that vision with local community leaders, from your political leaders, they will want to be a part of it, because most people want to be a part of something that's helping others. That's what our experience has been. So I just think that you really should do it, look in your community, see what the services are, see where the gaps are, and then build your ministry off of that.
Thank you. Rich, you are also the co-author of Fishing Differently, and you've been here on day one. How do you think this case study, the work that David has done, how does it align with the book, and how might people use this case study from your perspective?
Well, that's a lot to tackle, but I wanted to first lift up something that Teresa has just said, that core to all of this is overcoming a scarcity mindset. Many churches, especially when they're struggling in numbers, they're aging, the ability to raise money from the congregation can have its limits. And so it's very easy to have that tendency to dwell in that scarcity mindset, instead of, as Teresa so eloquently said, that you have to look outside for those that are aligned with you in the ministry and the mission, and you will find them, because they may not look like you, they may not worship with you, but there are people that share the impact you're trying to have in your community. I think that's part of the question that you asked, is that, how does it align? Well, I look at Table of Hope and what's been done as a real model for the fish or fishing differently principles. So, we talk about the faith, intellectual, social, and human capital. Just to briefly give the abridged version of what those mean. we think of the faith capital as the financial resources that are within the church, the intellectual capital being the gifts and talents and experiences of those that are members of the church. The social capital is a big thing, as Dave mentioned, that it's too often a tendency, just like the scarcity mindset, to look inside the church instead of outside the four walls, and to think of how can, in this case, a under-resourced church have an outsized impact. And that's done through, as you were the example, reaching out to, and I was there, so I saw it. When Sidney came to town, it was like a whirlwind. He showed up at every gathering, be that the Rotary or the Lions or the town council or anybody that would listen to his vision for how he wanted to serve the community, he was there. And that came to have big benefits later on, as they were at one part of what we talked about, or what was talked about in the case study, was that Bethel was flooded as a result of a hurricane and didn't have the resources to take care of it. And because of Sidney's ability to connect outside the four walls with leaders and other stakeholders within the community, somebody showed up and said, we're going to walk with you. We're going to take care of the flood damage, and we're going to help you build the commercial kitchen that you so desire, because we want to also see that Spring Street Table of Hope is able to feed the people within the community. Maybe you can remind me of the other parts of the question. You're on mute.
You're a certified church consultant, and you've seen other church consulting models. How does the Fishing Differently approach distinguish itself from other church consulting models?
I think in some ways, and I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but in some ways they're on opposite sides of the coin. Many of the church consulting models focus on capital raising programs, and they tend to target internally at the congregation. And they also focus a tremendous amount on the growth of the congregation. And while those are both valid and important exercises, we all want thriving congregations that are growing. And many of the African-American churches that are in communities that have undergone a lot of change, many times those the natural congregation is no longer in the immediate area, so their ability to attract large numbers, like a larger church may be able to, are limited. And so where this idea is really different is it's not focusing primarily or exclusively on growth and capital raise. It's the opposite of that. It's looking out in the community and saying, how can we serve? It's it's a real different mindset. And sometimes it's swimming upstream a little bit from what many people think of doing church, the way we've always done it. People are resistant to that kind of change. And back to that scarcity mindset, it's not limited to finances. Many churches look at, we're small and we're aging and we don't have a lot of people to do the actual work. That's where this is so different, because it's an invitation to the community to join with you to do the work that needs to be done. And you will find those people that align with you missionally, because they are out there. And it's just a matter of getting out there and putting your message out there about what your intentions are. You will find them.
Thank you. One of the questions that just came in on Facebook is about, what are legislators, what's the message to legislators it reminds me, I recently was interviewed by Crane's, the Crane's Business Journal in Chicago. And the nature of that article was that churches were not paying taxes and they were extracting value or resources out of the communities. Dave or Teresa, anybody want to respond? What's the message to legislators about the role of faith-based organizations? Should we be paying taxes on the property we have, or should we not?
Well, I'd say some churches probably should, but not yours. So yeah, tongue in cheek, but I mean, it gets to what Rich is talking about, that a lot of churches are internally focused. They are essentially a club and they should be paying taxes. So I might be disinvited from future panels, so sorry about that. But if you have oriented your mission around the community's mission, then it's obvious that you are a benefit to the collective good. And I don't think anyone is going to ask you to pay taxes if you're delivering, groceries and meals to hundreds of thousands of people.
Teresa, you want to share on that? I know you work with a number of legislators.
Well, I don't know, Dave. There's a lot of clubs that are nonprofits. We work with a lot of them at the Rotary clubs, nonprofit, and various organizations anyway. So I'm not sure I believe that churches should be taxed. I don't agree with that. They're doing work, whether if it's internally focused, people are there for a reason. They're hurting, they're in pain, and they're struggling, and they're there for a reason. And that's a form of assistance. That's how I look at it.
What is the message to legislators? How can legislators help churches achieve their mission?
Well, I think, I'll step in this moment of silence. I think I've seen it, the way that you've engaged across political lines and brought together people that otherwise wouldn't be talking. So that's even just one small benefit, is that, politics can be a game with a lot of friction between people that oftentimes have more in common, just like our society in general. People often have more in common than we consider. And I think by engaging with legislators who have, among the largest social capital, we're able to use their social circles as a source of support and volunteerism, as well as they can be a good mouthpiece, because what politician doesn't want to see good happening in their communities? So if they're going to politically benefit from it, so be it. But if it serves the mission of the church or CDC or nonprofit, that's the real goal anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I know, at least in our experience here in Morris County, we've had our Congresswoman who's been very helpful with respect to some of the environmental justice work we're doing. One of the things that I'll mention her name, I think it's worth mentioning, Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill understood the challenge we had around flooding issues, and the way the EPA did its evaluation of areas that they wanted to invest in need to be readdressed, because they did not prioritize areas that were considered lower income or to have a lower asset value. And she was able to challenge the EPA in their rubric to identify areas that maybe have experienced racial discrimination or segregation. And so we were able to get a $300,000 grant to do a flood study. And so I think legislators, when they understand the alignment, is not in this, because I think this is fear of separation of church and state. But I think that's more around religion and proselytizing as opposed to social impact. And so I think there's great alignment there. The other challenge we've had to come against, and I don't know if Dave or Teresa want to share the comment on this, is sometimes funders will shy away, foundations and philanthropic organizations will shy away from churches that are engaged in work of social impact. Dave, in your research for Jesus on Main Street, did you come across any of those reservations or obstacles between philanthropic organizations and faith-based organizations?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are some foundations who have maybe policies or procedures that are, I think, pretty restrictive. So yeah, I think that's an area for growth. And again, I think as churches step up and take on some of the social impact that we've been talking about, I think some of those barriers and, misgivings are going to start to fall by the wayside. I'd like to just make one comment, if I may, on the legislation aspect. An example from Portland, godless, unchurched Portland has an amazing success story in terms of affordable housing and congregations pulling together and having a strong voice to the city of Portland for changes that were required for regulations in zoning and different rules to make it easier for congregations to build affordable housing on their properties. So it even resulted in the city of Portland developing a new faith city liaison in their housing department to work with communities of faith to develop affordable housing, which I think is important in pretty much every community around the country. So I'd say that that's one example of interaction with legislatures and with government that faith communities can have.
Teresa, you want to share any experiences you've had with funders and the biases towards faith-based organizations?
Well, I think with any funders, but with foundations in particular, because they give out larger amounts of funds, they're very restrictive on who they give those to. So it tends to be a very limited group of individuals who tend to receive the larger funds. And so smaller nonprofits tend to not have those opportunities. It's almost like with credit, right? If you have a great credit score, you're going to get the best deal. And if you don't, you won't. It's very, I just think it's a very similar concept because a lot of people that are on the ground doing the work don't have the resources and capacity to have the right financial statements to, just to do all the building blocks that you need to do. There needs to be a little bit more training. So sometimes that's frustrating because a lot of the smaller nonprofits really struggle with getting real dollars to have real impact because the quality, the way to do that, the qualifications are very stringent.
Rich, I know earlier I'd asked you about the work of Crossing Capital Group and Fishing Differently. In what ways would you say to our listeners that Crossing Capital could help them in this journey?
Well, very much in line with what's just being discussed. One of the things that we discuss with our clients who are seeking to do community impact work, many of them have experienced just what you and Teresa have just spoken about, which is that it's hard sometimes to find people that will align with a group from a church, much less a church outside of their own denomination. Sometimes there could even be a racial component. Hopefully it's not a negative one, but just a familiarity differential there. So one thing that we talk about is that there is potentially a benefit in having a separate organization outside of the church, be that a separate 501c3 or a CDC. It gives you the advantage of not having that connection to the church directly. And that can help with volunteerism as well as with funding partners. One of the other advantages that we talk about with our clients is that when you are forming a board for this 501c or CDC, your environment is different from who you can pluck from. So you can get people that are not necessarily religiously affiliated, but missionally affiliated or aligned. So that can be, people of varying political, social, religious backgrounds that all have a common interest in the mission of that nonprofit. And one of the great benefits of that is you can exponentially expand your intellectual capital in this way, because you can incorporate politicians and lawyers and accountants and project managers, et cetera, et cetera. And then the beauty of all that is then you get these concentric circles of their social networks. So you have a board of 9 or 10 people, you have 9 or 10 diverse networks that they can bring into it that never would have even known you existed. So when people get vested in this by being a board member, all of a sudden you're getting a spotlight shined on the organization that never would have gotten that attention at all. And then, as one other thing that Teresa mentioned was, it's so important to get it right from the start, to make sure that when you're incorporating this organization, that's done properly, that you have the good governance, that you know what's required, because if you mess that up, you could lose your designation. So, having the reporting and the financials and all of that, having proper insurance and all of that is just so important. And it can't be just, overlooked, because it will come back and really negatively. It could negatively impact you as an organization, or if something did happen, just the bad publicity can have a real negative effect that you sometimes can't overcome. So getting it right from the start is the advice that we like to give.
I think, Dave, you mentioned earlier about the importance of training pastors. What are your thoughts on that? And how important is it to have professional guidance or advice from companies like Crossing Capital Group?
Yeah, so when I alluded to training pastors, I guess that was a kind of a general observation that, in the world that we're in, as good news, churches are starting to pay attention to these things, developing affordable housing, social impact. Bad news is most seminaries don't prepare their pastors for that kind of work. So they have to do, a quick on-the-job training. So, Sydney, you're involved with some of this work, as am I, in helping some seminaries to up their game, add coursework to help pastors who are, new pastors coming out of seminary, so that they at least understand the basics of community development, the basics of economic development, et cetera. We can't expect all of our pastors to be MBAs. That helps, obviously, but I think we can do a better job of preparing new pastors. We've mentioned fishing differently principles. We have a lot of expertise in our pews. We've got the experts in our pews. So that's another thing that I think I would also mention, is that, this isn't a role for just the pastor to figure out. This is a chance for an accountant who has always wondered, how does my CPA apply to kingdom work? Well, I bet you could put them to work, Pastor Williams. Marketing person, how can I use my product marketing and management experience for the kingdom? Teresa, I bet you could use some folks like that. So I think there's a lot of expertise that has been not fully leveraged in our pews. So I'm excited about this movement and what it can mean for people that have not gone to seminary, but yet want to serve in a meaningful way in their community.
That's really insightful, David. It's funny, you took me back to 15 years ago when I told everyone I did not want to go to seminary, did not want to be a pastor, just wanted to serve in my capacity. But sometimes there are barriers, right, to what lay people can contribute. Sometimes they can be intimidating to people that don't have those expertise and skill sets. And so sometimes it's helpful to have someone outside of the church context who can come in and you sort of overcome some of those organizational dynamics. Rich, do you want to add anything to that, or Teresa, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd like to just, talk about a couple of things that we're doing at Crossing Capital to work with churches. Congregations oftentimes have aspirations, and one of the stumbling blocks they have is where to start. So we developed a congregational assessment that is really focused on alignment. And so we look at the 4 pillars of FISH: faith, intellectual, social, and human capital. And we've developed a survey that's quite focused on those principles, and it takes very little time to complete. And so we developed it in a way that's really unique in the market, because not only do you get the insights into the beliefs and preferences and practices of the congregation, but you also get to see, based on how people identify their role within the church, how they align in those opinions. So we allow people to self-identify as a member of the clergy, as a lay leader or church officer, or the senior lead pastor. And so that way we can look at how do they align. And sometimes we find that it's perception, sometimes it's reality. So sometimes if it's perception that something is thought of in a very different way, sometimes it's a communication thing that just needs to be addressed. Other times it can be a real gap in a belief or a practice or a preference, and so that needs to be addressed, because before you can move forward, you need to make sure that you're aligned to move forward. Some of the other things that we touched on earlier, we're also very involved with is the doing, making sure that our clients are set up for success. Be that as simple as bookkeeping or accounting services or online, web presence. We have a diverse number of services that we can offer to churches to help them, as they're undertaking new things. And as we're moving forward in coordination and by ourselves with Oikos Institute, we're looking to help churches as they're looking to do the projects that David alluded to. Many are looking to either on the church property or property that they may own outside of where the church resides. They can, we're going to help them find the proper funding to help that project come to fruition. And we have a network of professionals, be that developers or architects, et cetera, that we can bring to support them and to help them to have a stake in the project, instead of simply being bought out for 50 cents on the dollar by a for-profit developer. And so we're doing a lot of things to help support these churches as they're looking at a new future and trying to reimagine what it is to move forward.
Thanks, Rich. Teresa, you're going to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. No, I was just going to compliment what Dave was saying in regards to tapping into those whom are either in your congregation or in your volunteer pool. And, we have had significant transformation of the organization because we have tapped into individuals who are retired executives, bank executives. One woman, she revamped our whole inventory system and automated it for us. And another woman's retired engineer just added to that system and created others. So they've streamlined a lot of our processes. And these are just, and it wasn't like, we were just looking, we started talking and understanding people's backgrounds, and they wanted to help. So to what Dave's saying, sometimes it's untapped. We don't realize who's there and what skills they have. And many times they're willing to help.
On that point, I think on your slide, Dave, you mentioned about lowering the barriers to entry for volunteers. I know, Teresa, you kind of work with both church members and community volunteers. How do you balance that tension and holding people together, where one is loyal maybe to the church, the other may be loyal more to the mission of the work that we're doing? How do you balance that?
Well, with the growth, it kind of we don't have an option. We need volunteers, period. We don't have an option. So either our volunteers will come from the church, and we do have church members who are very faithful and loyal, extremely helpful, but we don't have a large pool from the church to tap into. We have, we do have a senior group. We have, and we don't have a large volunteer pool. We have, on the other hand, the nonprofit, we have 2,000 member volunteer pool. So it's I don't feel like it's a tension. I feel like it's just what are the resources that we have and who's willing to come and help. So for the church members that come, very faithful, and very helpful, and they get along very well with the other, volunteers are not of the church. Obviously that there was a lot more tension in the beginning, but things have kind of worked themselves out where it's a lot healthier environment in terms of church members versus non-church members volunteering. But I think because the organization has grown so much, the capacity has really made it a place where, we've got to go to the pools that we can to get access. We can't just depend on church members for access to, to support.
Yeah, I remember when Dr. Reginald Blunt came to visit, he made an observation, and for any pastors listening, the idea of control versus stewardship. And so, Table Hope operates within the walls of Bethel AME Church, and Bethel gets to be a steward of this work, but not necessarily control it. Table Hope has a separate board, separate tax ID number, separate funding source, separate pool of resources, but it still operates within the bounds of the church. And so the tension I was referring to is what Dr. Blunt was talking about, the difference between control and stewardship. As pastor, I've had a couple of members who felt as though because they were an officer of the church, they can then make decrees about what happens at the Table of Hope. And we've had to wrestle with that balance. Yes, you are a trustee of the church, but not necessarily a board member or a director for Table of Hope. And so as we hold those things together, it can be a challenge. And as Teresa, you said, the growth has happened so quickly, it's almost an imbalance of how we hold that tension. So, but thank you for sharing.
And just to add to that, it still is a challenge because, like you said, Bethel is a steward, right, of the Table of Hope. So everyone's inside, mostly inside, I mean, not, Bethel Church at some point in this process. So the church trustees have to work with the employees of Table of Hope. So there is, we constantly are working together in order to make this thing work, because Bethel is a steward. Bethel takes care of the building, and Table of Hope contributes in different ways. So it definitely has to work, and it can be challenging, but
Yeah. One of the questions from Yvonne Murphy is there a fee for working with Crossing Capital? Rich, you want to answer that for?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there has to be a fee. We are a for-profit business. I think you'll find that the first step, which could be the assessment tool, and one thing I left out, trying to self-edit myself so I wasn't rambling, was that another key aspect of the assessment is that when you get your results in a report that is delivered after the assessment is complete, we also include a demographic study that comes from the census in a self-defined area around the address of your church building. And what that allows you to do is to see, what is the makeup of your community, and that'll help to guide discussions and further investigation into what kind of ministry and needs exist. As Teresa said earlier, it's a mistake to say this is what we're going to do without first looking at what is being done and what is the need of the community. So this kind of information is invaluable. And
what's the cost to use the tool?
It's $4.99 for a congregation, which we've gone to considerable lengths to add value to it, and looked at other tools out there, and that's very competitively priced, because we know that many congregations don't have the resources to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on these types of things. So we do our best to walk along with you, and we can follow up the assessment with other consulting and advisory services that we feel are extremely well priced in the marketplace.
Thank you, Rich. We're coming to the end of our time. Want to just do a round robin, last remarks, comments. Dave, we'll start with you.
You got me speechless. Well, like I said, I'm inspired when I find people like yourself and Teresa and the work you guys are doing. I would just hope that, folks who watch this, who maybe watch the recording, are inspired by, what's possible for churches to do. There are tools out there, Rich, you've mentioned a few. It is uncharted territory in some sense, but there's also a lot of people that have been doing this. So we're in an exciting time, and I'm excited to see more churches do this kind of work.
Teresa?
Well, I just want to say for any, if it's a small congregation, it's out there, or I guess that applies to any congregation in terms of the work you want to do in the community, just to stay encouraged, really look for opportunities that aren't being met, and just stay steadfast and make sure that you build those relationships with the stakeholders, which is critical, so that you can get the resources that you need to do whatever it is the mission you decide you want to focus on.
Rich, just before I come to you, I do want to address Maria. She had a really good question. She wanted to know about potential liabilities for churches that allow people to use their space. And yes, there can be liabilities. So it's important that nonprofit organizations or for-profit organizations that use space from you have their own insurance, their own workers' comp insurance, their own property and liability insurance. You should get to know their board members. So yes, thank you for that question. Excellent question. And that's being a good steward of making sure that the people that are using your space, because if not, then you could potentially become liable as the church for how that organization operates. Background checks are also important. We want to avoid anything that would jeopardize or cause a problem for that church to have exposed to liability. So thank you for that question, and we appreciate that. I think Maria asked that question. Thank you, Maria. Rich?
Well, I guess the one thing that has been a constant for some time is that many of our churches are struggling to attract youth, and so as a result, many of them are aging, and they don't see the ability to be a magnet for the younger millennials and Gen Zs. Around what we've been talking about in terms of social impact, there's been some really extensive studies done by Pew and Barna about the desires of the younger generations, what they're looking for in churches. And the big things that jump out are they want to be accepted for the gifts and talents they bring, not to have to spend a decade paying their dues before they're allowed to do anything of value for the church. And two, they want to do social impact. That is primarily, they look at their faith as a verb, not necessarily sitting in pews listening to great preaching and good singing. They want to be out in the community making a difference in people's lives. So to the degree that you're inspired to do social impact work, I think what you'll find is that you'll catch the attention of the next younger generations by being out there and being visibly involved in your communities.
Thanks, Rich. Thank you to Dave Cresta for the wonderful work you've done. We're looking forward to seeing you in Chicago. Next week, we're here, our Fishing Differently conference in Chicago. It's our first national conference. It's not too late to register. Please go to oikosinstitute.org. All the conference information is there. We've got a pre-conference luncheon where Dave Cresta will go more in depth with his presentation about the case study. Bishop John Bryant, senior bishop or retired senior bishop at AME Church, who wrote the foreword for Fishing Differently, will also be with us in Chicago. And then on Wednesday evening at Fellowship Baptist Church, the Reverend Dr. Tracy Blackman will be our preacher for the evening. You don't want to miss that. We've got a great psalmist, Albion, will be with us. Just go to the website, get the information. And then Thursday morning, we start off with our design lab, and we want to invite you. This is a different kind of conference. You'll be invited into small group conversations with peers to exchange ideas. We've got Sean Jenwright, sociologist from the West Coast, wrote a book called The Four Pivots. If you've not read that book, you ought to add it to your library. Sean Jenwright will be with us on Thursday, September 21st. And then on September 22nd, Dr. Rosalind Artis, president of Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina, will be our closing plenary speaker. There's going to be a great opportunity. Oh, and how could I forget? We've got an Impact Award banquet. We're going to be honoring Dr. Jeremiah Wright with a Lifetime Leadership Award. You don't want to miss that. We've also identified some pastors and leaders who are fishing differently. We're going to be giving them Impact Awards. Please go to our website, Oikos Institute for Social Impact, oikosinstitute.org, to get the information about the upcoming conference. And then for those of you on our YouTube channel, please like and subscribe it, share it with others. I'm so thankful for those who've been watching on YouTube tonight. You can go back and visit some of our previous webinars. There's a lot of good content on our YouTube site, but please share it, like it, subscribe. For those of you on our Facebook site, thank you for interacting with us tonight. We really appreciate your questions. Please share it and help us get the word out. And to our good friends from Texas Methodist Foundation, along with us here on Zoom tonight, we thank God for you and your support of our work in Dallas, Texas. And if you don't have a copy yet, get a copy of the Fishing Differently book. It's available on Amazon. Please order that book. And if you like the case study is available on our websites. Visit crossingcapitalgroup.com. You can find it there, or on the Oikos Institute site, you can find the case study. And we want your feedback, whether you want to comment on YouTube channel, on Facebook, or email. Just let us know what we can do better, what topics you want us to cover. Big thanks to First Lady Teresa, my wife, amen. We thank God for her and her leadership. And to my business partner and co-founder, Rich Babcock, thank you for being with us tonight. And to our guests, thank you. We appreciate you, and hope to see you in Chicago next week. God bless. Have a good night.